Chapter 1 Happy Landings. Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Hawkins, United States Marine Air Corps, looked down on the flight deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, then checked the heads-up display. Airspeed 300 knots, altitude 800 feet. Perfect. He lowered the tailhook on the FA-18E Super Hornet and prepared for a 50-degree left bank turn. Extending the speed brake and setting the throttle to idle, he began interval air braking. He was about to engage the autopilot, but suddenly changed his mind. After establishing U.S. freedom of navigation rights in the South China Sea, the Nimitz-class nuclear-powered supercarrier had made San Diego, California its new home port. That deployment had been Hawk's last, and it had taken him literally around the world. As part of Operation Fisted Glove, the carrier had launched 1,800 sorties against al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. The strikes totaled more than 10,618 flight hours and delivered over 1 million pounds of ordnance. Hawk had flown more than 100 of those sorties. Sitting behind a stick of 44,000 pounds of super turbo fan thrust, he directed super airstrikes on people he'd never seen. He was glad he'd never seen them. He didn't allow himself to even think about them. He was carrying out his orders. And the number one thing Hawk Hawkins always did was carry out an order. Bottom line, nobody could ever say that Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Hawkins didn't have the right stuff. But occasionally, in the quiet of the wee hours, he sometimes worried for his immortal soul. But none of that was on his mind right now. He hadn't flown combat in years. These days he was enjoying the relative peace and quiet of the Miramar Headquarters Squadron. He was at a point where he wasn't interested in higher command. At this stage of the game, all he wanted was to finish his bit and retire with benefits. He'd been promoted to lieutenant colonel only a year ago, and even if he stayed in, he didn't like his chances of ever making full colonel. He knew he could keep jockeying for another 10 years or so if he wanted to, but he was ready to go. It had been one hell of a ride, but it was over. This was the last time he'd land one of the fiercest combat fighter jets ever made on the deck of the Big Stick. That's why he hadn't engaged the autopilot. He wanted to be personally involved with every moment of this final approach. As he extended the slats and slowed the fighter further, he remembered the days when he'd been terrified of this maneuver, especially at night. The thought of planting a jet plane on a skinny, rolling, pitching 500-foot strip of paint in the middle of the ocean at 130 knots in the dark was scary. It still was, but nothing like it used to be. He checked his airspeed again as he headed into a 90-degree donut on final approach. As the jet dropped to 450 feet, he eyed the glide scope on the optical landing system. The trajectory was good. The meatball was on the line, and he was on speed. He suddenly called out, 324 Hornet, ball 9.1. The system responded,
Ball.
Down below, the crew made ready. Moments later, the tailhook snatched a high-tensile steel cable stretched across the flight deck, and the jet slowed from 130 knots to 0 in 2 seconds. It never got old. Like a base runner trying to beat the throw. You never knew if you were safe until it was over.